Okay, I'm glad that you guys found the video. Remember, the videos are always going to be posted on YouTube, so watch them now, take notes, and when it's time to study for a test or for the test, the AP test, remember about the videos and that you can go back and re-watch them as many times as you would like. Another great thing about the videos is that, and you guys have probably already figured this out, you can pause whenever you'd like to stop and take more notes if I'm moving too fast. So please keep that in mind. Okay, so the theme of chapter 27 and 28 is empire building, or imperialism. After the American Civil War, which you remember ends in 1865, the United States grows exponentially, not just in North America, as you already know from reading chapter 26, which details the takeover of Indian lands in the Midwest, so like in Kansas and South Dakota. We're not just talking about that. Now we're going to start to expand the United States beyond North America. Okay, so in the 1890s, the American nation spreads to a few different areas internationally. It spreads to the Caribbean, to Latin America, and to Asia. If you remember from world history, this era, what we've called in U.S. history the Gilded Age, is the same area that European history refers to as New Imperialism. So the things that we're about to learn that the United States is doing, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, they're doing the same things to Africa. So keep that in mind just for some context. Now, you already know that the process of taking over North America, beginning with Jamestown and the Massachusetts Bay Colony through Chapter 26, you already are well aware that that wasn't a peaceful process. So you can probably assume, and I think it's safe to do so, that the process of expanding internationally to places like Hawaii and Cuba and Panama is also not going to be peaceful. So take a look at this map. Most of these places, the acquisition of these territories should sound familiar to you. You remember that these are the original 13 colonies, Jamestown, or Virginia, Maryland, New York. Okay, so you know the story about those. You also know about the Old Northwest Territory, which was acquired under the Articles of Confederation government. So, Manifest Destiny drives the American people from the East Coast to the West Coast. So remember, what war is responsible for the acquisition of California? The Mexican War. This entire section of land is called the Mexican Cession, acquired in 1848. Texas was annexed in 1845. You remember that this whole chunk of North America was bought from the French, and it's the Louisiana Purchase. And then there's Oregon, of Oregon Trail lore. Here's a more detailed map depicting the continental United States, its states and territories in 1896. You can pretty much see on the map that the nation has already gone from sea to shining sea, and we've talked a lot about that in class. What do you do with all of that extra manifest destiny type energy? Do you just stay stagnant in North America? Do you move southward into Mexico? Do you move into Canada? Or do you go to Hawaii and Cuba and Panama? Well, the answer is to expand to Hawaii, Cuba, Panama, and other places, and that's what this chapter is all about. Okay, so this is a cool political cartoon, especially if you're a visual learner. It depicts a giant American eagle spreading its wings across the globe 10,000 miles from tip to tip. So just take a second to look at this political cartoon and just remember that the United States, because it's conquered North America, is now expanding even farther both eastward and westward. So before we move any farther, I want to talk about foreign policy. So take some notes on this slide. Foreign policy, just so that you know, is a nation's view on the rest of the world. Foreign policy dictates for any people how they, as a nation, interact with everyone else in the world internationally. The Monroe Doctrine is an example of American foreign policy that we learned last semester. Do you remember what the Monroe Doctrine stated? The Monroe Doctrine essentially said that Europe should stay out of the American hemisphere, the Western hemisphere. There was a corollary to it that basically said that the United States would also stay out of European affairs and that there shouldn't really be any kind of foreign policy interaction between the United States and Europe. So, in the 1880s and 1890s, for the first time, we see something different than the Monroe Doctrine. We see a different U.S. foreign policy. Now Americans, like I said, because they've conquered basically the entire North American continent, are going to have to form a foreign policy. They're going to have to change the Monroe Doctrine if they want to start building an empire. So, with this shift in American foreign policy during the 1880s and especially during the 1890s, historians start to describe American interaction with the rest of the world as empire building. Write that term in your notes, empire building. You've probably heard the same thing referred to as imperialism, which is the process of building an overseas or transcontinental empire. A couple of examples of empires that are more familiar to you are the Roman Empire, or maybe even the Soviet Union, which was pretty much an empire covering a huge continent. If it helps you guys to think about it like this. The United States started out here on the East Coast, and every generation it added more and more colonial possessions until it basically kicked out all of the indigenous inhabitants of this whole part of an entire continent, whether they be Sioux here, or the Cheyenne Indians here, or the Mexicans who were there before the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. In the process of seizing that land from its indigenous inhabitants, the United States forms an empire. So there are 4 factors that I want you to write in your notes that encourage this idea of imperialism in the mindset of American politicians and the American people. The first one, it has to do with economics. Around this time period, and you already know this because we've talked a little bit about the Gilded Age, American industry and agriculture are producing more goods, more steel, more food, more stuff than ever before. So much, in fact, that there's a surplus of goods at home. So one of the ways that American producers sought to maybe make more money was to export things outside of the country because there was too much stuff for Americans in the United States to buy themselves. So exporting was a natural option to encourage American economic growth and to sustain it. And what better way to export stuff than to force people internationally to buy it from you? The second factor that encouraged imperialism during this time period was the press, or the media. An example of the press today would be CNN, which is my favorite news group. Maybe you like Fox, maybe you like MSNBC. If we think that the press has a huge influence over the way that we think today, I think the influence was even more profound during the Gilded Age. Historians refer to this period of media as yellow journalism. That might be one of your ID terms, so write that down, yellow journalism. Yellow journalism was written by newspaper publishers like Joseph Pulitzer of the Pulitzer Prize fame and William Randolph Hearst. These two men owned really popular newspaper conglomerates that encouraged Americans to, quote, adventure overseas and to spread American values. Stories of, the Congo and Africa and the Philippines and the Pacific and the legendary wealth of Hawaii and its sugar fields, those kinds of stories sell very well. So in order to keep selling more and more newspapers, people like William Randolph Hearst embellished the truth. We call it yellow journalism because sometimes the things that they wrote in their papers, more often than not, were greatly exaggerated. Thirdly, we have the white man's burden. I hope that you've heard of this concept before, the white man's burden, because it's a really important concept in world history. It motivates Europe and the United States to do terrible things to the rest of the world. Basically, the white man's burden is the idea that white people, or Europeans and Americans, were morally obligated to share Western values with non-white people, so with Asians and Africans. The idea here is that if Americans and Europeans have so much prosperity, it probably has something to do with their race. So it then becomes their moral obligation to take their technology and their Christianity and their languages and their schools and forcibly spread them to Asia and Africa, just like the Dawes Act promoted to the Sioux Indians. Okay, the fourth factor on this slide is the Navy. You need to be aware of Alfred Thayer Mahan's very influential book titled The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. Alfred Thayer Mahan was a historian who wrote that book chronicling and describing what he thought was the most important factor in stimulating a nation's growth, and that was a navy. He looks at a map of the earth and he says, "Hey, most of the earth is basically a giant ocean, right? So if you want to build a country, if you want to build an economy, you need boats to do it." So that encouraged a lot of Americans to buy into this idea that the United States should have a strong navy. And in order to have a strong navy, you have to have a foreign policy that says that you can use that navy. So you can see all four of these factors played out through four examples or case studies of American imperialism. Let's go into those. Okay, so the first example of American imperialism in chapter 27 is that of Venezuela. The British Empire owned a section of South America called British Guiana, and near it was the country of Venezuela. Between the two between the two nations was a disputed area of jungle, basically. There wasn't a whole lot going on there, but both countries wanted it, right? So the British and the Venezuelans were at one point almost at war with each other. They were arming, they were gearing up to fight each other over this disputed area of land that happened to be in the Western Hemisphere. Remember the Monroe Doctrine? It stated that the British especially should stay out of the American zone of the world, the Western Hemisphere. So the United States, the U.S. government under President Cleveland and his Secretary of State, Richard Olney, they saw an opportunity to just basically show the British that the Americans actually meant to enforce their foreign policy from now on. So they used the Monroe Doctrine as a justification to prevent the British from seizing land from Venezuela. So the United States sided with the Venezuelans against the British, thereby upholding the Monroe Doctrine. The United States and Britain almost went to war over this example of Venezuela. A naval conflict looked pretty imminent, but the issue went to international arbitration, and in the end a war was averted. But the point of all of this is that through the example of Venezuela, we see the prestige or the strength of the Monroe Doctrine upheld in a new era post-Civil War. So that's example number one. This map shows Hawaii in perspective with the United States. Here's the part of the United States that we've studied so far, and here is Hawaii. As you can see, huge distance even between San Francisco, which is the closest point of the United States, and the Hawaiian Islands. Trivia question, what's the big naval base that was in Hawaii? Pearl Harbor. Besides sugar, Pearl Harbor is really the only use that the United States can get out of Hawaii for a long time. Until now, when we would love to go on vacation there. Oh, and in case you were wondering what the Germans were doing, the United States and Germany split an island chain that they would both call Samoa, and Samoa still to this day is part of the United States Commonwealth. Okay, example number 3, China. China, of course, has always been a major world power. So China, Europe, North Africa, India, they've all been linked in a giant global exchange for 1,000 years at least, right? So around this time, the 1780s, 1790s, European powers have started to become powerful enough to where they can control that trade instead of China. They call the shots, not the Chinese Empire, right? So Britain, Germany, Russia, and a couple of other European powers have begun to carve out what are called spheres of influence, or basically trading cities in China, where they control what goes into and what leaves China. For example, opium. The British are forcing the Chinese to buy opium, which is just terrible, right? This is going to start to sound really Eurocentric. Anyways, the United States Secretary of State, a guy named John Hay, decided that he couldn't just sit by idly and let the Europeans carve up China into European zones of influence. He wanted America to basically get its fair share of the Chinese trade. So John Hay comes up with what we call the open door policy. The open door policy is basically a foreign policy statement that demands that Europeans respect Chinese values and free trade. Is free trade really an imperial Chinese value, or is that basically just a way of the United States saying, hey, Europe, don't take the entire global pie without giving us a piece of it, okay? So that's really what the open door policy is all about. It's not about respecting Chinese value and Chinese economic interests. It's more so just a statement demanding that Europe doesn't ignore America when it's carving up the Chinese empire into spheres of influence. So as you can imagine, the Chinese don't want to. Most Chinese people don't just want to sit around and be forced to buy opium and be forced to buy British and German goods at really really high prices. Okay, so a group of Chinese militants in Western history curriculum, we call them the Boxers, and we call this episode the Boxer Rebellion. By the way, if you're curious, you should Google what the actual title of this rebellious movement was. It's really long. See if you can figure out what it is. Anyways, the Boxer Rebellion occurred in 1900 when a group of ultra-nationalist Chinese militants rebelled. They killed about 200 whites, which in the grand scheme of things, that isn't a whole lot of death and destruction, but most of those whites happened to be school children and missionaries and priests, okay? So when word got back to the press in the United States and Europe that priests and children had been assassinated by these really, really militant Chinese people, the United States, Europe, and some other major world powers sent an army, a coalition, which included several thousand U.S. troops, to put down the rebellion in China, and it was successful. They ended up charging China, by the way, about $333 million, forcing the Chinese to pay for a war that really didn't amount into that much bloodshed. Okay, so anyways, all that is to say that China, the open door policy is, you can look at it as an extension of America trying to even insert itself into China and the Chinese trade.
Okay, case study number 4, the last one. Cuba is the example of American empire building. The island had been a part of the Spanish Empire for about 400 years when in 1895 the Cuban people revolted to secure their independence from their Spanish imperial masters. Your textbook has some really interesting quotes. I say interesting dubiously, and this is one of them. In its description of the Cuban insurrection against the Spanish, your textbook says, quote, "American sympathies, ever on the side of patriots fighting for freedom, went out to the Cuban underdogs," which, you know, American patriots seized land from the Native Americans, they stole land from the Hawaiians, so maybe they're going to want to steal land from the Cubans after they help the Cubans gain their independence. So, remember yellow journalism, one of the 4 factors that encourages imperialism? Well, the American press, because war sells really well, the American press wrote stories in popular newspapers. They published them all across the country, and a lot of people read them. But the problem with the stories is that they weren't necessarily true. They were only slightly true. They were exaggerated tales of the atrocities that the Spanish were doing to the Cubans. You know, supposedly the Spaniards were butchering the Cubans and putting them in concentration camps and murdering their children. And to a certain extent, those stories were based on a grain of truth, but they were greatly exaggerated in an effort to sell newspaper articles, basically. So, with all that said and done, in 1898, the United States government, acting on the Monroe Doctrine, which said that the Spaniards shouldn't really be able to do anything in Cuba, even though they had been for a long time, acting upon that idea, in 1898, the United States government dispatched a battleship called the Maine to investigate the situation in Cuba. So there's a really weird twist of fate here. On February 15th, 1898, for some reason or another, the Maine mysteriously exploded off the coast of Cuba, killing 260 men that were on board the ship. So, like I said, war sells really well, and so does random explosions on American naval vessels, right? So the yellow press finds out that the Maine has blown up just off the coast of Cuba, and guess who they blame for it? The Spaniards. Okay, so actually the Spaniards had nothing to do with the explosion of the warship, the Maine. In 1972, after a long period of speculation, a U.S. government report finally concluded that the Maine suffered not from a Spanish torpedo attack, but from an internal combustion when coal overheated and a spark flew from the coal tank to the gunpowder tank, blowing up the ship. So really, the Maine was a casualty of bad shipbuilding more than anything else. But either way, when the Americans heard supposedly that the Cubans were responsible for blowing up a U.S. warship, They were ready for war. Just so you can get a visual, here's an image of the wreckage of the Maine.
Okay, so the American people wanted their war and they got it. That war was the Spanish-American War, fought in 1898 between the Spanish Empire and the United States. Actually, President McKinley didn't want to go to war. He thought that the main event had been sensationalized in the press, but the American people, including one Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Theodore Roosevelt, wanted to go to war. So, that's what they did. Now, in April of 1898, what was called the Teller Amendment was passed by Congress, and it promised that in the event that the United States was able to help the Cubans get their freedom, the United States would generously give the Cuban island back to the Cubans. How nice of them, right? So the war was over almost as soon as it started, and it's mostly because the United States military was more modernized than the old Spanish military. The U.S. Navy was made of steel. The Spanish Navy was made of wood, so you can kind of guess how that went for the Spaniards. Um, the Cuban island was taken pretty quickly. One event that you should probably know about the war in Cuba is the Battle of San Juan Hill, in which Teddy Roosevelt actually participated in. He raised a regiment called the Rough Riders. They were basically untrained cowboys. He had them shipped to Cuba, and they fought there against the Spaniards. The more important event that you need to know, though, is the seizure of Manila Bay on May the 1st of 1898 by Commodore George Dewey. He's an American naval commander who basically took his fleet, sailed into the Philippines, and told the Spanish commander there that he was taking over the islands in the name of the United States, and it worked. Pretty cool, right? So either way, the Spaniards lost the Spanish-American War, and they were forced to sign an armistice with the United States. That armistice gave the Philippines and Cuba to the United States, thereby ending the Spanish Empire and creating the American Empire. So war always looks different to the other side, the side that you're not on. And this is a political cartoon by a Spaniard depicting the U.S. as an invading thief, basically stealing Cuba from the Spaniards, who actually stole it from the Native Americans. So I guess what goes around comes around, right? Maybe we should remember that as a people. Especially when you consider what happened in the Philippines. This is the part where I want you to do the work. I want you guys in a second to get out your textbook and look up what's called the Filipino insurrection. Or if you're a Philippine, it's called the Filipino-American War. The information that I want you to find is found between page 637 and 648, so the end of chapter 27 and the beginning of chapter 28. So I want you to turn to those pages and look up these questions. Pause the video now, write these questions down in your notes, and jot down some quick answers once you've scanned those pages. When you've found your answers, we're gonna discuss them as a class. So, a quick recap of the conclusion of chapter 27. The impact of the Spanish-American War is pretty big. You can nail it down to two different things. First of all, by taking over the Philippine Islands, your textbook says that the United States became what it calls a full-fledged Far Eastern power. And it actually goes beyond the scope of the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine said that the United States had the right to defend the Western Hemisphere. But now, by taking over the Philippines, the United States is putting itself into the Eastern Hemisphere and putting itself into European and Asian affairs, thereby making itself a global power, not just a regional power. Secondly, and this has been a recurring theme since we fought the Civil War, because the war was a national effort that included troops from both the South and the North, it inspired nationalism for Southerners and Northerners and healed the wounds to a certain extent of the Civil War. So it was a national effort, not just a sectional conflict. Okay, so that's that. Now our discussion question. I want you to pause after you finish taking your notes, and we're going to discuss this question as a class. Remember, I want you guys to turn in these notes and the notes over the chapter 28 video to me for a formative grade on Monday.